Hey there, friends. Welcome to the Taking Your Next Step podcast from Collegians for Christ. Through each episode, we will journey together focusing on knowing what you believe and why you believe it. If you are eager, like I am, to strengthen your faith and take your next step now by joining us in today's episode. I'm really loving our study as we're going through leadership lessons in the book of Nehemiah. Looking at Nehemiah's life, he inspires me. I've gotten so much help just in my personal life, within my ministry, where God has placed me to be a leader, the people and the students that I get the privilege to influence. Nehemiah is just a powerful character, and I can relate to him in so many ways. And so we see now as we come to Nehemiah's life, he is a leader who has to begin to motivate and delegate. And I think that's a mark of a true leader. A leader is someone who influences people. I'm going to continue saying that so that'll sink into us, that leadership is not about a position. Leadership is not the loudest person. It's not the one with the most followers. Leadership is about influence, so anyone can be a leader. And as we see through Scripture, God makes leaders. A leader is not necessarily born. You and I can be made into good leader. And a good leader adds value to people's lives. A leader knows, though, that he or she cannot do everything themselves. A good leader knows the value of other people. And a good leader knows the value of a good team. I can imagine Nehemiah looking at those walls, and if Nehemiah had the I'm going to do everything myself attitude, they'd probably still be rebuilding those walls today, because that's a giant task. And maybe God's called you to a giant task. Maybe God's called you to a medium or small task. But learn as a leader that you and I, let me back up here, really, when you think about our goal as leaders is to influence people, it should really be kind of a circular thing. Meaning we're teaching them to teach others also. We're leading them, influencing them so that they can influence people, other people as well. We're leading people to be leaders who are leading people to be leaders. There's a constant circular idea there that we're developing leaders within those that we're influencing. And so Nehemiah knew he could not rebuild the town wall all alone. That would be an impossible task. And so Nehemiah could, though, rebuild the walls with the help of some others. And so Nehemiah has a huge challenge before himself. One, he must inspire a defeated, discouraged, apathetic people to begin rebuilding. And he must delegate the work so that the job must be completed. And so we see, first of all, in our passage in chapter 2, verses 17, 18, and right into the beginning of chapter number 3, Nehemiah, we see the inspiration to build. Nehemiah finally reveals his plan. If you remember from our episode last week, Nehemiah went on a 3-day, quiet, under cover of night survey trip. Now Nehemiah is ready to move into action with the people. He calls a town council meeting after his 3-day survey trip, and he begins to move a defeated people to begin rebuilding. How does he get these people to begin moving? Well, he does very plainly remind them of their condition and situation. He doesn't neglect from that. He says, look, you see the ruin and waste that we're in, but he begins to identify himself with the people. He doesn't say, hey, you need to do this. You need to do that. I can't believe you haven't done this. He doesn't ridicule them. He doesn't make them feel bad about their situation. He just brings up the reality of their situation, and then he tells them, let us rise up and build, which shows that he was identifying himself with the people. He said, you see the distress we're in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. I want you to see us. He identifies himself with the people, and that is a hallmark, if you will, of a true leader. And I love the story of Costco and how it began, and how the founder felt as CEO that he was not above the people who worked on the floor. He traveled to every store location every single year, and he wanted to be known on a first name basis, and he wanted people to know that he was approachable, that he wasn't above. He identified with the people, and that was a huge success to him and also to the company of Costco, and it was a big part of its success. And here Nehemiah is identifying himself with the people. He said, let us rise up and build. And then Nehemiah begins to reveal his credentials. This is how he is inspiring these people to rebuild. He lets them know that God is behind it. I can imagine him sharing. This is why it's so important that you and I pray specifically, because I can imagine Nehemiah beginning to share the very specific prayer requests that he had, and also begin to say, hey, I know God's in this because God answered this specific prayer request. God answered it this way. And because God answered it this way, I know God's in it. And so I had prayed for God to give me favor with the king. That's not easy to be done. I prayed that God would give me the resources. And I can even imagine Nehemiah beginning to open up the letters and show them the letters from the king to the keeper, Asaph, and showing, hey, look, this is what God has done. And they'd be like, wow, okay, yeah, God is on this. And he's saying, look, God's hand is upon me. This is not some fly-by-night idea. It is God's will for us to rebuild these walls, and knowing that the king is behind it, that the king allowed Nehemiah to leave, and the king is giving the resources or providing the authority to get the resources. This would reveal to the people the credentials that Nehemiah had. And this, what is their response? Let us rise up and build. And it says they strengthened their hands for this work. Why the sudden change? Like, what changed in their life? Well, Nehemiah inspired them. He inspired them that this could be done. He didn't back away from the reality of the situation, but he also identified himself with the people and revealed that God was in it. And here are the credentials, and this is what God is doing. But we instantly see, as quick as Nehemiah inspired the people to rebuild, we see the interruption not to build. It says immediately that Sanballat and some enemies, Tobiah, rose up instantly, and it says they laughed the people to scorn and despised them and said, what is this thing that you'll do? Essentially, they were saying, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen. It's amazing how quick the enemy comes in. How quick you can say, yes, God, I'm going to do this. And how quick the enemy comes in. Or God is doing a great thing in your life. He's answering prayer. He's opened up doors. You're seeing God move in miraculous ways. And immediately the enemy comes in. We've experienced that recently, personally. We've seen it time and again. God begins to move within our personal lives or our ministry. And God's doing great things. And immediately, I mean, it's almost like you're on the lookout and Satan comes in and tries to stir up strife or discourage you or cause this illness or sickness or cause this division. And it's so hard when you have critics, but a hallmark of a leader is how to respond to critics. We're going to look at that in greater detail in one of our upcoming studies, but they tried to scare Nehemiah by appealing to the law to scare him with authority. They say, what is this thing that you do? Where do you have this authority? How dare you rebel against the king? Well, what they didn't know is Nehemiah had the king's authority. You see, if Nehemiah had come in there without praying, this kind of shows us if Nehemiah had been on a whim and just said, hey, let's go do it, and went straight to Jerusalem and never had the king's blessing, never had the king's authority, never had the king's resources, this plan more than likely would have failed before it ever got off the ground. Because he may have got there and tried to inspire them, but they may never have gotten the inspiration because he had no credentials. He couldn't prove that God was in it. And then as soon as these enemies rose up, the people would have been like, look, we're done. He's talking about the king. The king could come in and kill us. And Nehemiah would not have had the authority of the king. But because Nehemiah waited patiently, he prayed, he allowed God to open up the door, then guess what? He was able to say, guess what? I have the king's authority. I have the king's letters. And he was able to silence these enemies, and they began to rebuild. And so an immediate response was given. You know, as a leader, you and I need to know when and how to respond to critics. And it's hard. Sometimes the critics are on the outside. Sometimes the hardest ones are the critics within the inside. Some of them can be Christians even, and they can be the hardest critics. But sometimes you and I need to keep our mouths shut to the critics. Sometimes a soft answer turneth away wrath. If you and I engage in the debate or engage in the argument, we just stir it up even worse. Sometimes we need to keep our mouths shut. Sometimes we do need to answer. And here Nehemiah answered, and I love what he said. He said, then answered I them and said unto them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we are his servants, will arise and build. But ye have no portion nor right nor memorial in Jerusalem. He says, look, I'm letting you know God's in this. I'm letting you know that's who I'm appealing to, and you're going to have no right nor memorial in Jerusalem. And so sometimes a response is needed to be given, and sometimes we need to be quiet, but as a leader, we need to discern those times. And so we see quickly the interruption not to build, but then we see lastly here the instructions to build. Chapter 3 kind of goes through, and it's almost one of those genealogy chapters where you're like, oh my word, like this person begat this person begat this person begat that person. And we understand there's history there, there's a reason it's there, but sometimes when you're just reading it devotionally, it can be hard to read through. When you go into chapter 3, you find this: next unto him repaired, next unto him builded, next unto him builded, and the whole chapter's like that. So it's almost like next chapter, please. We can almost skip over chapter 3, but there is so much truth within chapter 3. The strategy, the planning that Nehemiah did in chapter 3 is so practically helpful for us. Nehemiah has a job bigger than he can accomplish on his own. And so here Nehemiah, as a leader, he began to delegate the work and the authority. It's interesting, Nehemiah begins with the leaders. It says the high priest began to build first, and the priest. It's interesting that he began with the spiritual leaders. He began with the leaders. He knew if I can get the leaders that are already here, that people are already connected with and have faith in, then guess what? They'll begin to follow. That's where the inspiration began. So he begins with the high priest. They begin to build in their certain section of town to build up the sheep gate, which has some spiritual meaning to it anyways. But everything rises or falls on leadership. And Nehemiah knew if I can get the leaders in the town to begin building, people will begin following suit. And then we see that Nehemiah begins to delegate to others. He places everyone at a specific section of the wall to rebuild. He says over against his house, over against his house. It's interesting that Nehemiah placed them in their hometown area. Why is this? Because one, it's very efficient. They're already there. They don't have to travel back and forth for work. Two, they'll be motivated to rebuild it because, hey, this is their hometown, home section. This is the wall, part of the wall that I'm going to see. There'll be some pride in their work, and they have some ownership in it. They would be heavily invested in this area, and this is just a very efficient way to work. It's interesting, though, as you go through chapter 3, you do see some people not rebuilding. It says the nobles put not their necks to the work. Then it talks about the Decoites rebuilded one part, and it says they also rebuilded another part. And so you will always have some people that won't want to get their hands dirty. This is the difference of a leader. Jesus teaches us servant leadership. He said, look, I came not to be served, but to serve. You see, the wrong type of leadership is to point fingers and not be willing to get your hands dirty yourself. Nehemiah was willing to get his hands dirty. The high priests, the spiritual leaders, were willing to get their hands dirty to rebuild this wall. You see, the wrong type of leadership says, look, I'm not willing to do that kind of work. I'm going to stand back here in my position and tell everybody else what to do. That was not Nehemiah, nor how Nehemiah delegated work. Nehemiah, in essence, had everybody begin working all the way around the wall. Everybody had a section from the beginning to the end. Nehemiah could have began with one small section, rebuild it completely, move to another section, but that wouldn't be efficient, one, and then the work would be even slower doing it that way. But Nehemiah had them all the way around the city, which also brought protection around the city. They could protect themselves because enemies had already rose up against them. And so Nehemiah delegates this work. And it's very easy sometimes for you and I to say, look, I'm just going to do it myself. I know how to do it. I'll do it better. You know, not every brick would have been just like maybe Nehemiah wanted it. Maybe the way they spread the mortar, maybe the way they used the trowel was a little different than Nehemiah would, but that's okay. You know, you got to give people opportunity to lead. You got to give them opportunity to get into the work. And that's part of leadership. And sometimes it can get messy. You know, and I think as we are leaders, we need to use our leadership influence to add value to people's lives. We need to teach them and guide them. And sometimes they're going to teach us because we don't know everything. And so I love the leadership of Nehemiah here, that he's willing to delegate out the work. He motivates people. And I think a big part of that is you and I are influencing people and you and I are leading people. We need to identify with them and we need to be willing to do the nitty gritty. We need to be willing to move the chairs. We need to be willing to stay after. We need to be willing to take out the trash, wash the dishes, whatever it takes for that event, for that gospel event, for that outreach. Whatever it takes for you and I as a leader, we need to be willing to identify with the people and get down in the nitty-gritty.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. If this podcast has been helpful to you, please share it with a friend or subscribe to stay up to date on the latest episodes.
You can connect with Collegians for Christ online for more information and resources at cfccampusministry.com.